The first thing I noticed about the Queen was how she stopped mid-sentence. Not a pause, not a hesitation. A full stop like a clock winding down in the middle of its tick, the second hand just hanging there, trembling between two moments. She was speaking to her High Council, the 7 Velathri who hovered in their levitation rings, robes of bioluminescent silk rippling like aurora, and she simply stopped. Her mouth was still slightly open. Her eyes, those galaxy-deep eyes that the poets of 16 star systems had spent careers failing to describe, had gone somewhere far away and very quiet. The council exchanged glances, not subtle ones, the kind that said, "This has happened before." I was standing near the service alcove at the edge of the grand chamber, holding a repair kit for the crystalline acoustic panels that lined the vaulted ceiling. Maintenance staff. Technically, I wasn't supposed to be there during council session. Technically, I was supposed to have finished the panel calibration an hour ago and left. Technically, there were a lot of things I wasn't supposed to be doing, including watching the Queen of the Velathri Collective quietly unravel in real time, while 17 billion beings waited on her next breath. My name is Declan Marsh. I'm from a small town in Oregon that no longer exists, on a planet that most Velathri couldn't locate on a star map without help. I am 34 years old, I have a mediocre engineering degree from a state school, I play guitar badly, and I have been stationed on Velathra Prime for 2.5 years as part of the Earth Liaison Delegation's Technical Support Corps. My official title is Harmonic Systems Technician, Class 3. My unofficial title, assigned by the Velathri Maintenance Supervisors, translates roughly to the Persistent One, which I've chosen to take as a compliment. I watched the Queen stand there in her silence for what had to be 30 seconds, long enough that the council started whispering to each other in their clicking, multitonal language. Long enough that the chamber's ambient harmonics, those low, ever-present resonance tones that the Velathri used to regulate collective emotional temperature, began to shift from their standard gold-warm frequency toward something cooler and more anxious. Then she blinked, straightened, said, "We will resume," in a voice that was perfectly composed with no acknowledgement that anything had happened. But I'd seen her hands. They were shaking. The Velathri are, by most accounts, the most emotionally sophisticated species in the known galaxy. This is not speculation or cultural flattery. It's measurable. Their neural architecture is built around what xenobiologists call resonance cognition. They don't just think thoughts, they experience them as full-body harmonic events. Joy isn't a feeling to a Velathri. It's a chord, a structured sound that moves through bone and tissue. Grief is a specific frequency. Anger is a dissonant interval that requires conscious resolution. Love, and I say this having read 900 pages of translated Velathri text on the subject, love is apparently a complex polyrhythmic structure that takes years to develop, like a piece of music being composed in real time. This is why the Queen's condition was so alarming. Her name, in its full ceremonial form, was Velsarath Elamini's Thyron, which translates to something like, "She who holds the collective chord." She was, as near as I could understand it, not just a monarch but a resonance anchor. Her personal harmonic frequency was literally broadcast into the Velathri communications network, forming the stabilizing base note for collective consciousness across their entire star system. When she was well, her frequency was described by Velathri poets as the sound of becoming. When she was unwell, as she had increasingly been over the past 14 months, the collective felt it like static in the bones. The condition didn't have a name in any language I spoke. The closest the Velathri physicians could get, in their careful musical translations, was harmonic dissolution. Her frequency was fragmenting, degrading. The clean, pure tones that had once anchored 17 billion beings were developing. There was no gentler way to put it: silence, gaps where music had been. The official explanation, shared with great delicacy by the chief physician Velora, was that the cause was unknown. Unknown, meaning the Velathri had been searching for a solution for over a year and had found nothing. Unknown, meaning that every treatment they'd tried had slowed the dissolution at best. Unknown, meaning that if no answer was found within what translated to approximately 4 of our months, the Queen's frequency would fall below the threshold necessary to sustain the collective chord. And when that happened, 17 billion beings would experience something that had never happened in their recorded history. Silence. They didn't know what that would do to them. No one did. The closest historical precedent from 600 years ago involved a brief disruption to a regional harmonic node that had lasted 47 seconds. The affected population had described it in the archives as something between death and madness. Not the event itself, but the 47 seconds of pure harmonic void. The Queen's dissolution, if unchecked, would not last 47 seconds. I shouldn't have been paying as close attention as I was. That probably goes without saying. My job was acoustic panels. Panel calibration involves adjusting the crystalline resonance tuning on large, complicated sheets of mineral composite that line the walls and ceilings of Velathri government buildings, ensuring that ambient sound is distributed harmonically rather than in the chaotic, emotionally disruptive way that reflected sound in an uncalibrated space would be. It's work that requires precision, patience, and a decent ear. What it doesn't require is understanding Velathri harmonic medicine. But I'd been on the planet for 2.5 years. I was curious by nature, and I'd spent a lot of late nights in the technical library reading things I wasn't technically cleared for. The acoustic panels, I had realized roughly 8 months ago, were not just architectural features. They were tuned to the Queen's frequency. Specifically, they were tuned to amplify and distribute her harmonic broadcast throughout government buildings, which then connected to the broader city-wide resonance network, which then fed into the planetary network, and so on outward through the collective. Every building I worked in was, in a sense, a receiver and amplifier for the Queen's voice. Every building I'd been calibrating for 2.5 years was slowly going out of tune along with her. I hadn't mentioned this to anyone, partly because I wasn't sure I was right, partly because I didn't have the standing to walk into a Velathri medical consultation and start offering theories, partly because the idea had been forming slowly, the way ideas do when you don't know you're having them, assembling itself piece by piece from late-night reading and long days, working with instruments that could measure frequencies the Velathri had stopped being able to hear properly. The Queen's hands shaking, though. That pushed something loose. The service hallways beneath the Grand Resonance Complex were long, cool, and quiet in a way that felt almost wrong after the warm harmonic hum of the upper chambers. I walked quickly, my toolkit under one arm, trying to think. What I knew. The Queen's harmonic frequency was degrading. The Velathri physicians couldn't find the cause. The dissolution had been progressing for 14 months without any clear trigger event. The panels throughout the complex were calibrated to her frequency, meaning they were also calibrated to her degradation, passively reinforcing the fragmenting pattern rather than the whole one. What I was not. A doctor, a xenobiologist, a musician, really. A person with any standing to intervene in the medical crisis of an alien monarch. What I was. A person who had spent 2.5 years calibrating instruments to harmonic frequencies. A person who had read, for reasons that had seemed purely academic until about 15 minutes ago, extensively about Velathri resonance cognition. A person who had, roughly 6 months ago, while replacing a panel in sub-corridor 7 of this very building, noticed that the calibration drift in the east wing panels was following a very specific pattern, not random degradation, but something structured, something almost like. I stopped walking. The corridor was empty. The hum of the building's ambient resonance system pressed against my ears. I stood there for a moment with my toolkit in my hands, doing the math that I'd been not quite doing for 6 months. It wasn't degradation. The fragmentation pattern in the Queen's frequency wasn't random dissolution. It was recursive. It was looping back on itself, each degraded cycle reinforcing the next degradation, like a feedback loop in a poorly calibrated sound system. Like a room with bad acoustics that keeps amplifying the wrong frequencies until the signal collapses under its own interference. The panels weren't just passive receivers going out of tune. They were active participants. Every calibration adjustment the Velathri maintenance staff had made over the past 14 months, adjusting the panels to match the Queen's shifting frequency, had been reinforcing the feedback loop. They'd been tuning the building to her degradation, teaching it to sing her dissolution back to her, louder and louder, each cycle pulling another strand of her frequency apart. My hands were very still on the toolkit. I thought about the factory scene. It was the third thing I'd learned about Ravel in the cultural exchange materials, not Ravel himself, but the idea. The machines making noise that the artist heard as music when no one else could. The rhythm that looked like mechanical nonsense from outside, but was, if you listened from the right angle, already a composition. I was listening from the right angle. The Queen wasn't dying. The Queen was caught in a feedback loop that her own healers were inadvertently amplifying. And the solution, if I was right, if the math held, if I wasn't making a catastrophic leap across a species-level knowledge gap, wasn't medical. It was acoustic. Getting an audience with the chief physician, Velora, took 4 days. I won't pretend those were easy days. I filed the request through the correct diplomatic channels, which meant the Earth Liaison Delegation's administrative attaché, a woman named Priya who looked at my request with the particular expression of someone who has watched a well-meaning technician propose the impossible and is calculating the diplomatic fallout. I explained, as carefully and briefly as I could, that I had a theory about the Queen's condition that related to acoustic panel calibration. Priya stared at me. I said the words again. She stared some more. "Declan," she said finally, "you tune panels." "Yes." "You want to tell the chief physician of the Velathri Collective that you know what's wrong with the Queen." "I want to share a theory about acoustic feedback and harmonic resonance systems that might be relevant too." "Declan, I know how it sounds." "Does it sound like career suicide? Because that's how it sounds." "It might sound like that, yes. I'm asking you to let me try anyway." She looked at me for a long time. I'd worked with Priya for 2 years. She was the kind of diplomat who had built her career on knowing when to pull the ripcord on a bad idea. I watched her doing that calculation and I waited. "I'll get you 30 minutes, she said. "Don't waste them." The chief physician Velora received me in a consultation chamber that was deliberately calibrated to neutral frequency, neither warm nor cold, designed to suppress emotional resonance and encourage analytical detachment. She was tall even for a Velathri, her bioluminescent markings at the subdued, professional frequency that indicated formal engagement. She had 3 assistants with her, all of whom regarded me with polite versions of the same skepticism Priya had shown. I had 30 minutes. I set up my portable harmonic analysis unit on the consultation table, pulled up the data I'd been compiling for the past 4 days. Every panel calibration record I'd made in the Grand Resonance Complex over the past 2 years, every frequency measurement, every drift log, and I started talking. I talked about the pattern I'd noticed in the East Wing panels. I talked about recursive harmonic feedback and how it differed from standard degradation. I talked about calibration drift as a passive reinforcement mechanism. I talked about the way the building's resonance system had been, with the best intentions, with perfect technical competence, amplifying the wrong frequencies because it was tracking the Queen's current state instead of her baseline. The assistants were making notes. I couldn't read Velathri expression well enough to know if that was good or bad. Velora let me finish. Then she was quiet for a moment, not the frozen silence I'd seen in the Queen, but a deliberate, processing silence. "Your analysis of the panel calibration drift," she said, in the measured, musical cadence of careful Velathri speech. "You are suggesting the drift is not consequential but causative." "Not exclusively causative," I said. "The dissolution may have begun for other reasons. But once the feedback loop established itself in the building resonance systems, it would have become self-reinforcing. Every calibration adjustment that tracked her degraded frequency, instead of her baseline, would have added another layer of interference." "This is not a medical treatment you are proposing." "No, it's an acoustic intervention. If we can recalibrate the complex's panels to her documented baseline frequency, from recordings made before the dissolution began, and hold that calibration stable regardless of her current frequency, we break the feedback loop. We give her resonance system something to push against that isn't her own degradation echoed back at her." Another silence. "You have accessed the historical baseline recordings." "I requested them through the technical archive, for calibration reference purposes." I paused. I may have framed the request somewhat narrowly. Something moved in Velora's expression. I still couldn't read it. The Velathri Collective does not typically accept medical interventions from. "I'm not offering a medical intervention. I'm a harmonic systems technician. I'm offering a calibration correction." I kept my voice level. "I understand if you want to have your own engineers verify my analysis before acting on it. I'd expect that. I'd want that. I'm just asking you to look at the data." Velora looked at the data for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "You have been on Velathra Prime for 2.3 years, she said. "Yes." "You were assigned acoustic maintenance." "Yes." "And in that time, you read our medical archives." "Your technical archives." "The resonance cognition material is cross-referenced with acoustic engineering theory." I followed the cross-references. "Out of curiosity." "Out of curiosity." Another silence. One of the assistants said something quietly in Velathri that I didn't catch. "I will verify your analysis," Velora said. "You will provide full access to your calibration records and your harmonic analysis methodology. If your theory has merit, we will discuss intervention parameters." "Of course." "If it does not, this conversation will have been very expensive for your diplomatic standing." "I understand." She looked at me again with that unreadable expression. "Why?" she asked simply. I thought about the 30 seconds of frozen silence, the hands that were shaking. "Because she was in the middle of a sentence," I said, and she stopped. The verification took 11 days. I gave Velora's team everything, my records, my methodology, every calculation I'd done in the 4 days between the council session and the consultation. I went back to the Grand Resonance Complex and continued my regular maintenance work, because the acoustic panels still needed calibration regardless of anything else, and because work steadied me. I told no one what was happening except Priya, who knew enough to be worried and professional enough not to show it. On the 8th day, one of Velora's assistants found me in Sub-Corridor 7, replacing a panel relay, and stood quietly until I noticed him. He said 3 words in Velathri that I knew from 2.5 years of context. "She wishes confirmation." I put down the relay. The confirmation meeting was different from the first. Velora had the full Medical Resonance Council this time, 9 physicians in addition to the assistants. The chamber calibrated to a frequency I'd never encountered, something that felt like the acoustic version of held breath. I was, by a wide margin, the smallest person in the room. "Your analysis is substantially correct," Velora said without preamble. "The recursive feedback pattern matches your predicted model with 91% congruence. The calibration drift in the grand complex panels is consistent with progressive frequency reinforcement of the dissolution pattern." I didn't say anything. I was making sure I was still breathing. We have identified 17 additional nodes across the city resonance network where similar drift has occurred. The scope of the feedback loop is larger than your initial model suggested. I hadn't accounted for the secondary network nodes. I only had access to the complex data. We understand. The full correction will require recalibration of all 17 nodes simultaneously, coordinated to within a 0.3 cycle margin, timed to the Queen's natural resonance rhythm. I thought about that. That's a significant coordination challenge. It is. We have been working on a solution for 4 days. We have not found one. She looked at me steadily. You have 2.5 years of calibration experience in this building. You know the panel systems in ways our engineers, who have never worked outside theoretical frameworks, do not. We would like your assistance in designing the correction sequence. The room was very quiet. 17 alien physicians looking at a Class 3 harmonic systems technician from Oregon. Yes, I said, I can help with that. What followed was the most intense 3 weeks of my life, and I've had some difficult years. I worked with a team of 6 Velathri engineers, brilliant people who knew the theory of harmonic resonance in ways that made my reading feel like the first chapter of a very long book, but who had, as Velora had said, never worked with physical calibration systems in a hands-on way. The gap between knowing how something should work and knowing how the actual physical thing in front of you behaves is the gap that I'd been living in for 2.5 years. It turned out that gap mattered. We mapped all 17 network nodes. We plotted the correction sequence, the order in which the nodes needed to be recalibrated, the precise frequency targets drawn from the Queen's baseline recordings from 3 years prior, the margin tolerances that would ensure the corrections reinforced each other rather than creating new interference patterns. It was like, and I kept thinking about this, trying to explain it to the Velathri engineers in ways that made sense. It was like tuning an orchestra. Not one instrument at a time, but all of them at once, moving from the current dissonant state toward a target harmony, every adjustment affecting every other adjustment, the whole thing needing to land together or not at all. A 1-minute melody, I said to one of the engineers on the second week, when we were staring at the coordination model at 2 in the morning. That repeats and builds. You have to let it run through the whole pattern before you hear whether it worked. He tilted his head at me in the Velathri gesture of partial comprehension. You are thinking of music. I'm thinking about how you build something that doesn't sound like anything until it's finished. He was quiet for a moment. The Queen used to say something similar, about the difficulty of trusting a composition that reveals itself only at completion. I thought about that for a while. That's what we're doing, I said. Trusting the completion. The correction day was chosen by the medical council based on the Queen's resonance cycle, a regular pattern in her frequency, still present beneath the dissolution, that created brief windows of relative stability. These windows were shortening as the dissolution progressed. The window we were targeting was 10 days out from the decision to proceed. After that window, the next viable opportunity would be nearly 3 weeks later, and the council's physicians had made it clear, with the quiet gravity that Velathri use when they don't want to alarm you, that 3 weeks was longer than they were comfortable with. We had one shot. The operation was, from the outside, almost entirely invisible. 17 technicians, 16 Velathri and me, positioned at 17 network nodes across the city at 2 in the morning, all connected through a shared communication link, all holding calibration tools tuned to the same target frequency. The Queen was in her chamber at the top of the Grand Complex, monitored by the medical council, unaware of the specifics of what was happening beneath her. Velora was coordinating. I was at Node 1, the Grand Complex panels, which was both the starting point of the correction sequence and the node with the most complex calibration requirements. If Node 1 didn't land right, nothing that followed would work. At 2:47 in the morning, in the cool, humming quiet of Subcorridor 7, I made the first adjustment. I'd made thousands of calibration adjustments in 2.5 years. Every one of them had been routine: find the drift, correct the drift, log the correction, move on. None of them had felt like anything. This one felt like every one of them at once. Every late-night reading in the technical library, every panel replaced in an empty corridor, every cross-reference followed out of pure curiosity, not knowing what it was building toward. The frequency shifted under my hands. On the communication link, Velora's voice: Node 1 reading stable, Node 2 initiate. Across the city, someone made the next adjustment. Then the next. 17 nodes, working outward from the complex in the pattern we designed, each correction feeding into the next, the whole sequence running like a melody. A repeating, building melody that didn't resolve until the very last note. I stood at my station and listened to the updates coming through and tried to hear the shape of it, the way you try to hear an orchestra tuning when you're backstage and can only catch fragments. Node 14 stable, Node 15 correcting, Node 15 stable, Node 16. A pause. Node 16 is reading interference. The drift here is more advanced than our model predicted. I heard the Vela3 engineer at Node 16, his voice careful and controlled. Recalculating correction parameters. We're at 14 seconds inside the timing window, Velora said. 14 seconds of margin remaining. 7 seconds of silence. Node 16 corrected, reading stable. Node 17 initiate. I was holding the calibration tool so tightly my knuckles ached. Node 17 stable. Velora's voice changed. Not much. Vela3 emotional modulation is subtle, but I'd been listening for 2.5 years. Collective harmonic resonance system is reading full network synchronization. All 17 nodes locked to baseline frequency. A pause. The feedback loop is broken. For a moment, nobody on the communication link said anything. Then one of the engineers, I didn't know which one, said something in Vela3 that I didn't know. It was 3 syllables, spoken softly, with a particular cadence that I'd never heard before. Later I asked one of the engineers what it meant. He thought for a while, the way Vela3 do when translation is genuinely difficult. It is what we say, he told me finally, when we hear a composition that we did not know was possible. The Queen did not recover immediately. That was the first thing Velora made sure I understood in the debrief the following morning. The feedback loop being broken was not a cure. The dissolution that had occurred over 14 months would need to heal over time, and that healing would depend on dozens of factors that remained uncertain. The correction had removed the active cause of the degradation. Whether the damage already done was reversible was a different question. But she will improve, I said. Velora looked at me with that expression I'd never quite learned to read. The preliminary resonance readings from this morning show the first documented stabilization in the dissolution pattern in 14 months, she said. The fragmentation is not advancing, whether it will reverse. But it's not getting worse. It is not getting worse. I let out a breath I'd been holding for about 3 weeks. There is one other matter, Velora said. She paused, in the Vela3 way that indicates careful composition of speech. The Queen's physicians monitored her resonance patterns through the night. At 4:22 this morning, approximately 90 minutes after the correction sequence was completed, her personal frequency showed what our instruments registered as a spontaneous coherence event. I looked up. Briefly, Velora said carefully, for approximately 12 seconds her frequency returned to its baseline harmonic state, fully coherent, undissolved. The silence in the consultation room was very different from the silence I'd stood in watching the Queen stop mid-sentence. Is that significant? We have not observed that pattern in 14 months. Velora looked at me steadily. Our analysts believe it is the first evidence of active regeneration rather than passive decay. The broken feedback loop has created space for the frequency to remember itself. I didn't say anything for a moment. 12 seconds, I said. Yes. I thought about 47 seconds, 600 years ago, and what it had cost the people who lived through it. 12 seconds running in the other direction. 12 seconds of the Queen being fully herself again, completely whole. The way she'd been before any of this started felt like it weighed about the same. Will you tell her? I asked. The Queen will be informed of all aspects of the intervention and its outcome, Velora said, including the role of the human maintenance technician whose curiosity exceeded his assignment parameters. Something in her voice, I thought, might have been amusement. I was still not certain enough of Velathri emotional frequency to be sure. How did you know? She asked, echoing the question from our first meeting but with a different weight to it now. That the theory was correct, before the verification, you had no certainty. I thought about it for a moment. I didn't, I said, but I've been working with these panels for 2.5 years. You spend enough time listening to something, really listening, not just measuring, and you start to hear what it should sound like. And I knew what I was hearing wasn't right. I paused. I also knew that nobody else was going to think to look at the acoustic panels, because they would not expect the answer to come from there. Because I'm a maintenance technician, I said. We look at things that other people walk past. 3 weeks after the correction, I was back in Sub-Corridor 7 replacing a panel relay, routine maintenance, the same work I'd been doing for 2.5 years, when I became aware of someone standing in the corridor behind me. I turned around. The Queen of the Velathri Collective stood in the service corridor in what I can only describe as a deliberate act of informality. She had no escort visible, no ceremonial robes, no council attendants. She was wearing something close to what the Velathri called working dress, not the floor-length bioluminescent silk of state occasions, but something quieter, her markings at a frequency I'd learned to associate with private conversation. I stood up and held the panel relay in both hands like a person who has no idea what to do with their hands. Technician Marsh, she said. Her voice was different from the recordings I'd studied, warmer, the consonants less clipped. The dissolution had left traces, I'd been told, but they were already receding. What I heard was something close to the baseline, something that moved through the corridor's resonance like a hand touching still water. Your luminance, I said. It was the correct form of address. I'd checked 3 times. She looked at me for a moment, the galaxy-deep eyes that the poets had failed at. I understood now why the poets had failed. Velora has explained what you did, she said, and how you came to do it. I want to be clear that the actual correction sequence was a significant team effort. The Velathri engineers who... I know what the engineers did. A pause. I am asking about what you did. Velora tells me you read our medical archives. The technical archives, the cross-references. Out of curiosity. Yes. For 2.3 years. I find resonance theory interesting. Her expression shifted in a way I couldn't classify. Do you understand, she said carefully, what you heard when you were listening to the panels? I thought about how to answer. I heard something that wasn't right, I said. I heard a pattern that had a shape to it and the shape was wrong. I didn't know what it meant when I started hearing it. I kept listening because I didn't know what it meant. Velathri physicians, she said, have been monitoring my frequency for 14 months. They heard the same data you heard. They heard dissolution, degradation. They looked for the source of the damage. They were looking for a medical answer. Yes. I wasn't looking for anything, I said. I was just calibrating panels. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed around us with the new calibration, stable, clean. The building's resonance aligned to the frequency it should have been holding all along. My people have a concept, she said. We call it Velsoma. It means, approximately, the hearing that does not know it is hearing. The listening that accumulates without intention, building a knowledge the listener does not know they possess until the moment they need it. She looked at me steadily. We consider it one of the highest cognitive capacities. It is rare among us. We have never observed it in another species. I didn't know what to say to that. I was in the middle of a sentence, she said. I am told you noticed. Yes. Most beings in that chamber had stopped noticing. A pause, a real one chosen, not the frozen kind. My own counsel had stopped noticing. The weight of that settled in the corridor between us. I notice things, I said. It's what I do, it's not remarkable. You are incorrect, she said simply. We stood in the service corridor for a moment. The queen of the Velathri Collective, and a Class 3 harmonic systems technician from Oregon, with the building singing quietly around us in the frequency it had been built to carry. There is something I wish to ask of you, she said. It is not a command, it is a request. Of course. The 17 network nodes you corrected, they will require ongoing monitoring. The calibration drift, even absent the feedback loop, will need regular adjustment as my frequency continues to heal and shift. Our engineers understand the theory, but you understand the practice. She paused. I am asking you to remain. I thought about Oregon, about the state school and the guitar played badly and the town that wasn't there anymore. I was already planning to renew my liaison assignment, I said, if the delegation would approve it. I believe, she said, with something in her voice that I finally, after 2.5 years, could identify as warmth, that the delegation will find the collective to be very persuasive on this point. I looked at the panel relay still in my hands, put it in the toolkit, picked up the calibration tool. Then I have panels to finish, I said. She inclined her head, the Velathri gesture that means, across all its ceremonial variations, something close to, received and understood. She left the way she'd come, no announcement, no ceremony. Just the sound of the corridor settling back into its quiet hum after her passing, the frequency clean and clear, and running all the way from this service hallway out through 17 nodes to the farthest reach of the city resonance network, carrying something that had almost been lost. I got back to work. That evening in the small quarters assigned to the Earth Liaison technical staff, I sat on the edge of my bunk and picked up my guitar. It's a bad guitar, the action is too high and the G string has never stayed quite in tune, and I've been meaning to fix both of those things for about 8 years. I don't play well, I never have, but I play. I played for a while, not anything in particular, just running through chord changes the way you do when you're thinking about something you don't have words for yet. The building around me was quiet. The Velathri night cycle had started, the city's ambient resonance shifting to its nighttime frequency, lower and slower, something that pressed against human consciousness like a heavy blanket. I thought about a melody that repeats 17 times and ends in a catastrophe. I thought about the 12 seconds. I thought about the voice in the service corridor, warm and direct, asking me to stay. Then I put the guitar down and opened my calibration log and started writing up the maintenance notes for the panel relay I'd replaced, because there were 17 network nodes to monitor and they wouldn't monitor themselves. And this was the work, and the work was the thing. And that, the ordinary persistent human fact of showing up to do the work and paying attention while you did it, was, apparently, the thing that had mattered. The building hummed around me. Clean, stable, whole. I wrote it all down.